In this video, we'll go over the basics of Sass. Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you're just starting or even thinking about starting a career in web development, you're in the right place. I upload new videos every week. Hit subscribe and the bell to get notified. So what is Sass? It's a CSS extension language. It gives your CSS superpowers. Once you see how easy it is to write and how logical and organized it can be, you'll never write plain CSS again. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Let's look at what you need to write CSS. First, you'll need a code editor, and I recommend VS Code because it's open source and it has great extensions and awesome community support. Now, your browser can't read Sass, so it has to be compiled into plain CSS. But don't let that scare you, it's easy. There's several ways that we could go about this. We could use Node.js to run a compiler that will watch our Sass files and compile them automatically for us. Or we could use Gulp to do the same thing. Or we could use an extension in VS Code. And for this video, that's what we're going to do. We're going to use Live Sass Compiler. Another extension that we're going to use is Live Server. If you're unfamiliar with VS Code and how to set it up for web development, I do have a video on that. I'll have a link in the description below. Alright, I'm going to quickly walk you through installing the Live Sass extension. So in VS Code, we'll go to Extensions and we will search for Live Sass. And there you'll see Live Sass Compiler. Go ahead and click on that and then click Install. And after that's installed, we're going to look at some settings. So let's go to our settings and then we'll search for Sass. And then click on Live Sass Compiler there. And then you'll see in the format settings, we're going to want to change the save location. Now these settings are a personal preference. By default, it will compile your CSS and put it into the same directory. And I prefer for the compiled file to go into my distribution folder. So we'll click on Edit in Settings JSON. And then here we're going to add some settings. So these are your options. So the default is at the top here. Format is expanded, so there's no compression going on. The extension name is .css, and then the saved path is null, so that means it's going to go into the same directory as your Sass files. So you could also change the format to compressed if you want, and it will go ahead and compress and minify your CSS all in one shot. And then you can change the extension name to .min.css, and then you see there where we can put it into our distribution folder. So I'm actually going to do just a combination of the two for this video. And we're going to keep the format at expanded and the extension as .css, and we're just going to change the save path to /dist/css. And then we'll save that and we're good to go. Alright, now that we have all of that set up, let's create a standard folder structure here. So I have a new project folder that I've created and I opened it in VS Code. And let's go ahead and create a folder here called dist. And then within our dist folder, we'll create an HTML file, index.html. And we'll use emit, we'll use exclamation, enter, get a template here, and we'll just name this Sass tutorial. And then we'll add a link here to our CSS. So currently we don't have one, but we will be adding it. Notice the extension here is CSS, not Sass or SCSS. So this CSS file is what's going to be compiled eventually once we've created our Sass files. Now before we create our Sass files, it's important to understand that there are two syntaxes supported by Sass. So there's the SCSS syntax, and it uses the file extension SCSS. And this stands for Sassy CSS. It's basically a superset of CSS, which means essentially that all valid CSS is valid SCSS as well. I'll show you that in a minute. But because of this similarity, it's the easiest syntax to get used to and the most popular. Now the other syntax is the indented syntax. And this was the original syntax for Sass. And it uses the file extension .sass. The indented syntax supports all of the same features as SCSS, but it uses indentation instead of curly braces and semicolons. There are a few other minor differences, but we're not going to be using SASS in this video, so we're not going to go over those. Alright, so we'll be using the SCSS syntax, and so let's go ahead and create that structure. So be sure you're in the root of your project and go ahead and create another folder here. And we're going to name this SCSS. And then within here, we're going to create a main.scss. Alright, now that we have that file open, we've got our extension installed, so now you should see this Watch Sass at the bottom. So go ahead and click on that. And you're going to see an output here. We'll see here that it's watching for our Sass files now, and it is compiling and generating them automatically, and now it's watching for us to save the file again. And when we save it, it's going to automatically recompile and create that CSS file every single time that we save the document. And so we didn't add this CSS folder here, but now we have a folder in dist, and so that extension created the folder and it created our CSS file. And of course we don't have anything in our Sass file, and so I don't expect to have anything in our CSS file either. So remember, we said that any valid CSS is also valid Sass. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here in our Sass file we can add, let's just do something generic here. We'll say body, background, and we'll set it to blue. And I'll hit save. And it automatically compiled our CSS for us. So now if we go to the CSS file, we'll see body, background, blue, just the same as we see it here. So we can write plain CSS in our Sass file and it will work just fine. So I also have a live server installed, so I'm going to go ahead and hit that, go live. And here you see we have a blue website. So an important note here is that we should never modify the CSS file, only modify the SCSS file. Every time the compiler runs, it's going to overwrite the CSS file. So the first Sass feature that we're going to look at is variables. Now you might say CSS has variables too. And that's true, CSS does have variables now, but Sass has had variables long before CSS. Currently, CSS variables compatibility across browsers is about 90%. So that's pretty good, and I don't see any reason not to use CSS variables. But when you use Sass variables, they don't compile into CSS variables. They compile to the actual value. So let me show you what I mean there. So in normal CSS, we could add variables like this. So now we could set our background here using a CSS variable, just like that. And so now if I save this, you'll see that our CSS file is pretty much identical to the SCSS file. And if we switch over to our website, we now have a gray background. So now let me show you the difference between this and the Sass variables. So with Sass, we can get rid of the root, and instead of the dashes, we'll add a $sign. So a $sign indicates that it is a variable. So instead of calling var, we will just input the variable. And I'll save this. We'll switch over to our website, and it's still gray. And let's look at our CSS now. We don't have any variables defined. It puts the actual value there. So using Sass variables has 100% compatibility across browsers. Alright, next let's talk about maps. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, you could compare maps to arrays. Maps are lists of key value pairs. So I'll create one here. So we'll define a variable, and we'll name it font weights. And then to define a map, we start with parentheses. So we enter a key, so we'll say regular will be the key, and then the value will be 400. We'll enter another one. We separate these by commas, so we'll say medium be 500, and then bold will be 700. Okay, it's probably not the best example, but you can create a map of colors or different things. So that we have something to really add this to, let's put some HTML markup in here. So we'll add a div with the class of main, and then we will put a paragraph, and we'll just put some lorem in here, 50. Alright, so now on the body we could apply a font weight globally if we wanted. To get a value out of the map, we'll use map get. Alright, and so it's looking for the map, and that would be font weights. And then the key would be, let's say, bold. So this may seem like a bit much, but if we have our font weights defined throughout our CSS in many different areas, and for some reason we want to change the way that the normal, medium, or bold font looks, let's say we want bold to actually be 900 instead of 700, I can change it in this one spot instead of searching through all of my CSS and changing it on each individual line. Now before I save this, let me pull up the website. Oh, and our text. We forgot a text color. Let's apply our color, and we'll set that to text color. Now we see that everything is in bold. So this looks at our map, and we tell it which key to look for. It finds the key, and then it extracts the value, and it puts the value here as font weight. So if we go to CSS, we'll see that our font weight is set to 700. All right, next let's talk about nesting. So nesting might be one of the best features of Sass, but depending on how big your project is, be careful with too much nesting. Using classes that can be reused instead of nest after nest is much better. But to demonstrate nesting, we will look at our paragraph here. So we have a div with the class of main and a paragraph. So let's look at the main div first. Let's say that we want to center it and add some margin on the sides. So we'll set the width here to 80%, and we'll set margin top and bottom to 0, left and right to auto. And this is just plain CSS, so if we go here, we'll see now it's centered and we've got some margin on the sides. Alright, so now if we wanted to style our paragraph, normally we would have to do main and then paragraph and do it like this. Or we could just do paragraph, and that would globally change all of the paragraphs. But we don't want to do that. With Sass, we can nest. So within main, we could just do this. And let's say we just want to put that font weight only on this paragraph. We'll move it down here. And I'll save that. Switch, and we'll see. Same thing, nothing has changed. And if we go to our CSS, you'll see that it has written it as proper CSS so that the browser can parse it. Now if we want to do this properly, let's add a class here to the paragraph. We'll set it to main paragraph. And then, so instead of targeting the tag directly, we could do main paragraph. If I save that, now it compiles properly into CSS. But with Sass, we have some shortcuts. So instead of typing main again, we could take this part out and we can use an ampersand. So ampersand equals the parent. All right, so let me save that and go to our CSS. Now it's not quite right because it's main underscore paragraph on its own, not within the main parent. So to fix that, we actually have to use something called interpolation. And what that means is we don't want just dot main paragraph. We want everything before it. And so we have to wrap the ampersand in hashtag curly braces. And so now what we could do is add a hover on the paragraph. And so we want to add that on the paragraph, not main. So we'll nest that again. And this time we'll use just one ampersand. And we'll use colon hover like we would normally. And then let's just change the color to pink. All right, and now I'll save this. And if we go to our website and we hover over it, now it's pink. All right, and let's look at our CSS. Let's see what happened here. So we've got everything separated as it should be in CSS now. So let's talk about separating files. So with Sass, we can create partial Sass files that contain little snippets of CSS that you could include in other Sass files. So if we're working on a large project, it's a great way to modularize your CSS and make things easier to maintain. A partial is simply a Sass file named with a leading underscore. So the underscore lets Sass know that the file is only a partial and that it should not generate a CSS file. So the compiler is going to ignore those files that begin with an underscore. So let's create a partial here. Make sure that you're in your SCSS folder, and we'll create a new file, and we're going to name it underscore resets.scss. Alright, now in this resets file, we're just going to include our normal resets. So we will do a box sizing of border box, margin of 0, and padding of 0. Alright, just some normal resets there. I'm going to save that. And then in our main SCSS, we'll want to include them at the top here, because generally we'll have our resets at the top. And so to include that, we will use an @import. And then we will indicate the name. So notice here that we don't have to put the underscore or the extension. So now if I save this and we look at our main CSS, it has compiled our resets into our main CSS from the partial. And also notice that the vendor prefixes are automatically added by the compiler. So what we could also do is we could create another file here, and we could name it underscore variables.scss. And then in our variables, we could take all of these and we'll put them into our variables partial. And I'll save that, and then I'm going to use Alt-Shift down arrow to duplicate that, and we'll include our variables. So now if I save that, you'll see that the variables are still working. So by using partials, we could separate major components into partials, and this is especially helpful when working with a team on large projects. We can break up the components and work on them individually. Alright, so now let's talk about functions. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, functions in Sass are very similar. So to create a function, we'll put it here at the top, and we're going to say @function to define that this is a function, and then we will name it. So this map get and the font weights down here, it's a bit much. It's kind of ugly. We can shorten that up, especially if we're going to be using it all over our CSS. So we're going to create a function that is called weight, and then we're going to open parentheses, and we're going to put an argument in here. We're going to put a variable of weight name, and then we're going to open it with curly braces. And within the function, we're going to return, and we're going to use map get, and we're going to target the font weights, and the key is going to be our weight name. So this variable here is going to be passed within our Sass file whenever we call it. So instead of map get down here, we're going to use the function name, weight, and within that we'll pass it the weight name that we're looking for. And if we change this to regular, it would return the regular weight. So let me save this, and we'll go to our CSS. Now we're looking for the font weight. Let's see what it is. Font weight of 400, right? So that's our regular font. If I go back here and change it back to bold, and we check our compiled CSS, now it's 700. Right, now we'll move on to mixins. And so mixins are similar to functions. So to demonstrate this, let's add some more HTML markup. So I'm going to just duplicate this, this paragraph here. I'm going to use Alt-Shift down arrow, create another paragraph, and I'm going to save that. And then back in our Sass file, in the main here, let's say we want to display this as flex. And we want to justify the content center and align items center. If you haven't learned CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid, I have videos on those as well. I'll put links in the description below. Let me save this, and let's switch over to our website. And we see now that our paragraphs are side by side because we define them as flex. So by default, that is going to flex to a row. Go back to our code here, and let's just say that we have many of these flex boxes that we need to create. And we don't want to type display flex and justify content and align items a million times. So we'll go up here and we're going to create a mixin. So @ mixin, and we're going to name this, and we'll name it flex center. And then within flex center, we're going to put all of this content that we don't want to repeatedly type. And now within main, instead of typing all of that, we will include the mixin. So @include and then flex center, just like that. Now I'll save that, and let's check out our CSS. And in our main, we've got all of our flex. And again, it's added all of the vendor prefixes as well. Now, similar to functions, we could also pass an argument into the mixin. So let's say we want to pass it direction. And then we could define flex direction as direction. So now instead of including flex center, we're going to also include an argument here. And by default, it is a row, so let's define it as column. And I'm going to save that, and let's go back to our website. And now you'll see that they are in a column and not a row. And of course, if I change this to row and save it, and now you'll see they're in a row. All right, so mixins and functions are very similar, but just remember that functions should be used to compute values and return values. Mixins should define styles. Another example of a mixin is choosing between a light and dark theme. So by default, right now, our website is a dark theme. So we could add a mixin, and we'll name it theme. And we're going to pass it a Boolean value. So we can assign Boolean values to variables. So we will say light theme, and by default we're going to set it to true. So now, again, if you're familiar with JavaScript, in Sass we can use if statements. So we're going to say if light theme, so that means if light theme is true, then we're going to set background. Now currently background is set to primary color, but what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this in a lighten, and then we can tell it how much to lighten it by. We're going to say 100%. So it's basically going to invert the color, and then we will need to set the color as well. Currently that's set to the text color. the text color is white by default, so we're going to need to do the opposite. So we're going to darken the text color, and we're going to do that by 100%. Alright, so now to use this, we're going to create a, let's go down here at the bottom, and we're going to create a light class. And we're going to include our theme, and we're going to pass it that variable. So light theme true. I don't have to actually type this light theme. I could just say true. This makes it a little bit more identifiable. All right, so let's save this, and now we need to add this class somewhere. So let's just add it to the body for now. Class of light, save that, and now let's go to our website. Now we have a light theme. And so now if we change this to false, let's see what happens. It's still a dark theme. Even though we have the class of light on body, it's still a dark theme. How is that possible? So let's look at our main CSS. We've got our body here, our main, all of our main paragraphs, but there's no light theme here. We go back to our SCSS, and we've got it included here. Well, we've included the theme, and we've said false. So if we go up here to theme, so if it's true, it's going to add these CSS styles to the light class. If it's false, it's not going to add anything, so that means the light class is empty. So when the compiler runs, if it finds a definition that's empty, it's just not going to include it in the CSS at all. Alright, so if I go back here and I change this back to true, let's look at the compiled CSS, and now we have our light class. Alright, back in our main Sass file, mixins are pretty cool, so I'm going to show you one more mixin. This one has to do with media query, so we're going to create a mixin, and we're going to call it mobile. And then we're going to use a media query. So just a normal CSS media query. We're going to say max width of, let's just say 800 pixels. And then in here we want to include content. So this content will be passed when the mixin is called. Now what we also could do, instead of defining this this width here, we could actually use a variable, and it would be better to use a variable because if we ever wanted to change it, it would be easy to change. So we're going to create a variable here called mobile, and we will just set that to 800 pixels. And then back here in our Sass file, instead of putting the value there of 800 pixels, we'll just include the mobile variable. Alright, so now let's see, what did I miss here? Content, there we go. Now to include this, let's say if the width gets below 800 pixels, we're going to want that to change to a column. Alright, so here within main, so here we're going to include our mixin, so include, and then that is going to be mobile. And then within this, basically view this as your media query. So what do you want it to do when it's below 800 pixels? So we're going to say flex direction column. Alright, let me save that, and I'll switch to the website. Alright, so let's make this smaller, and there you go. Once we get below 800 pixels, it changes to a column. Alright, and then move it back over. It's back to a row. Alright, and then if we ever need to change the widths, we have the variables here where we can change our widths. Alright, so now let's talk about extensions. So we can extend an element, and so the element that we extend it to would then inherit all of the styles from the selected element. So to demonstrate that, let's go to our HTML. We'll change the classes to paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Alright, so now here we will change this to paragraph 1. And so let's say that we want to extend all of the styles of paragraph 1 onto paragraph 2, we want them to look the same, but we just want to change one or two things on paragraph 2, and we don't want to have to retype all of the styles on both paragraphs. So we could do this. We have to interpolate again the ampersand, and then we'll do paragraph 2. And then here we could extend main paragraph 1. And we'll save that. Switch. And now they're both identical, just as they were before. But now we want to make a change to this paragraph. So we've extended all of the same properties, but let's say we want to, we'll use hover again. And this time we'll change the color to our accent color. Alright, and so now we have our accent color. So if there was a bunch of styles here in paragraph 1 and we didn't want to retype everything, we could just extend from that class onto this class. The last thing that we're going to look at is operations. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So in normal CSS, we could do calc, and then I don't know why we'd want to do this, but if for some reason we wanted to subtract 40%, that would work just fine. But in Sass, we don't need the calculation, and it will work just like this. We'll hit save, go back, and just the same. Now one thing to note with the normal CSS calculation, I could do minus 400 pixels, and see, this will work just fine. But with Sass, we can't mix types. So the operation has to be of the same type. So if we're using percentage, they all have to be percentage, or they all have to be pixels. So now let's see what that looks like in the CSS. So we have 80% minus 40%. So now we just have the result of that, which is 40%. So if we use the normal CSS calc, let's look at what the compiled CSS looks like. So it's going to go ahead and pass that entire calculation into our normal compiled CSS. All right, so that's pretty much the basics of Sass. So if you want to learn more, you can look at the documentation on sass-lang.com. Sass is very powerful, and once you get the hang of it, it's hard to go back to normal CSS. So that's going to be it for this video. If you stuck around to the end, thank you for watching. Alright, so before you go, if you liked this video, a thumbs up is appreciated. I upload new content every week, so hit subscribe and the bell to get notified. And if you think this video or any of the videos on my channel might be helpful to someone else, please share them. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at CodeStacker. Thanks for watching.